This morning, we begin by addressing the question of the global commons, and also we can celebrate that our co-sponsor of this conference and the funding that they provide for the new Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change, which is going to be led by Dr. Ottmar Edenhofer, who is on the panel today and who's really the inspiration for the panel that is about to unfold. I think it's a great step forward for INET, and we're very excited once again to have you as partner and to do whatever we can to complement your very formidable research. To lead today's panel, Bo Lidegaard from Politiken in Denmark. In Copenhagen, we had a lovely dinner a few months ago. We have lots of mutual friends, and just because we're all so well rested, we're going to leave this conference and go to Denmark and work together on setting up an INET in Copenhagen University joint venture in the 2 days following this conference. But Bo, you've been a thinker and a leader across a large spectrum of the issues, and I look forward to you bringing your wisdom and expertise to the leadership of this panel.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to moderate this session. I'll try to do that in a rigorous way, trying to keep our esteemed panelists to their time slots, allowing a bit of time also for discussion. But before I let the panelists loose, I would like to point out, and this may be a bit rude on a Saturday morning, a slight typo in the actual logo of this meeting, because it says paradigm lost. And I actually believe that we are talking about the loss of several paradigms. And I think what this conference is, or this session of the conference is very much about, is actually the interaction between the various paradigms that we've lost. Because we have been focusing in the preceding days mostly on the economic paradigm and the ways that we're trying to grasp what's happening in the world economy. What we will turn to this morning very much is our completely changing understanding of what is happening with man's interaction with the global environment and how that interaction plays back into the economy. In other words, it's not only a question, if that was not enough, of a changing paradigms in economy, it's also a question of including in a completely different way the environmental, the climatic, the resource-based related aspects into the equation. So it is a paradigm that is also having to include our new and dramatic understanding of man's interaction with the global climate, and again, how this plays back into the economy. As if this complexity would not be enough for a couple of days reflection, there is a third paradigm which is rapidly changing and again interacting with the two others, and that is the global political paradigm. I will not go lengthy into it, but just remind you that all, or literally all of the global institutions that we know and that we rely on for global cooperation have been established in a specific paradigm developed in the decade following Second World War, and based on premises that no longer hold true. This is the case for the UN, this is the case for the Bretton Woods institutions, but it is also the case for an institution like the European Union to a much larger extent than most people realize. Also, European cooperation is very much made in America, just like the UN and just like the Bretton Woods. And it is only because of the very active engagement of the US on the global institutional scene that we have seen a Europe uniting, that we have seen Britain uniting with the continent. That would not have happened if it had not been for the heavy leaning over both the continent and Britain of the Americans, nor would the enlargement of Europe after the fall or after the end of the Cold War. So also at the institutional level, we are moving into a world where the basic paradigms, where the basic institutional structures of the cooperation that we increasingly look towards, also there we are in a completely changing paradigm. And that again, as we have also learned over the last couple of days, play back into the economy and into our ability to tackle climate change and other major environmental problems globally. So both economically, environmentally, and politically, we are in changing paradigms. And I guess part of our inability to cope with these problems is our inability, our utter inability, I would say, to grasp the complexity of how these changing paradigms interact with each other. So before I then leave it to the panel to sort that all out and explain us how to incorporate the green aspects into our economic understanding, I will recall two small incidents or two small anecdotes from the lead up to the 2009 Copenhagen Climate Summit, which are very, in my view, illustrative of the points I was just making. And the first is actually from the conference itself, from the very summit part of the conference, and I'm revealing no secrets here because this is a little bit of conversation, a little bit of negotiation from the meetings between heads of states, which were later leaked to Der Spiegel, and therefore it's in the public domain. But in my view, it has been very poorly understood what actually went on. The little clipping that were recorded and later leaked recorded a conversation between the German Chancellor and the Chinese delegate in that negotiating room. And the issue at hand was the following. After protracted negotiations, there had been an agreement to have a global endorsement of the goal to try to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. That was, for the first time, a global consensus. There was an agreement, and now, of course, the EU very badly wanted to substantiate this global goal with the specific reference to the need to cut emissions by half by mid-century. So the Chancellor very strongly argued that science, the IPCC, demonstrated that in order to achieve this goal, there had to be a cutting by half of global emissions. And this should also be referenced in the text. And the emerging economies and China in the lead strongly refused this and wanted to retain only the global goal. And at that point, and this is where the records comes in, the Chancellor said, okay, if that is the case, I want the EU goal, the goal that the European Union has already decided to cut our emissions by 80% by mid-century. I want that reflected in the text. That is something we have decided, and I ask nothing in return. And that was strongly refused. And for most people listening to this, there was the notion that here Europe was being humiliated. I do not think that is the right interpretation. What the emerging economies were saying was exactly what they have been maintaining all along the way, namely that they would not undertake at this point in time quantitative reduction commitments. And they would do the math just like anyone else. If the EU takes 80% reduction, what's the residual that the rest of the world is going to take? How much will the Americans take? Not much. So what's left for the emerging economies? So what the emerging economies really saw here was a Europe trying to sneak in through the back door the notion of quantitative reduction commitments. And that, of course, was a red line that all developing countries had maintained throughout the negotiations. I'm quoting this little discussion because it does illustrate, I think, a very fundamental point, namely that in the sphere of global environmental politics, you cannot conceive of sort of going in through the back door. There's no way we are going to agree anything that the individual countries concerned do not front up consider in their own national interests. And I think this is a very fundamental lesson that we all learned in Copenhagen, that there's no forcing hands, there's no smart formulations that will eventually catch anyone. There is only the consensus on mutual interests, and if that is not there, nor is there any agreement likely to be reached. The other little incident or moment was a meeting we held in Copenhagen exactly 3 years ago with a group of scientists that were representing all parts of climate science. The idea was to get together well in advance of the climate summit in December, the most esteemed climate scientists, and ask for their political advice to world leaders. And therefore we had not only the IPCC crowd, we also had economists, political scientists, we had a broad range of science present, and we asked these 400 eminent climate scientists from all over the world to come up with specific recommendations for the politicians to look at in Copenhagen. And in order to underscore this political aspect of the meeting, we had arranged for the Danish Prime Minister, who was designed to chair the climate summit, to come to the last session of the scientific conference and at that moment be handed over from the scientific recommendation for the political decisions that were to be taken in Copenhagen later that year. So we had some of the most esteemed, I will not mention names here, professors and climate scientists on a panel very much like this. The Danish Prime Minister was standing at the podium, he got his recommendations, and here is now the moment that was quite revealing, I think, not only to me, but to quite a number of the people present in the conference hall. One of the professors, a professor well known to all of you, felt obliged at that point to make a little nuance to the recommendations. Because what science basically said was, you need to go for the 2 degrees goal, and in order to achieve that, you need to keep a concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at 400 ppm, 450 ppm. That is the target that we are going to try to establish, and we're going to have to get the measures to reach that concentration in Copenhagen. So when this had been said, the professor took the floor and he said, I just want to make one thing clear, Mr. Prime Minister. This is our recommendation, but I can give you no guarantee. There are uncertainties here, And many of us believe that in order to get sufficient assurance that we will actually stick within the 2 degrees, you need to shoot for 350 ppm rather than 450 ppm. I cannot say for sure which is the right figure, but of course, if you go for 350, you will be more likely to actually stay within the 2 degrees threshold than if you reach 450. We simply cannot tell today which is the accurate figure, but the safest figure, of course, is the lower figure, which I think was no surprise to anyone in the hall. But it was to the Prime Minister, who said, "Can I ask you please, Professor, to be clear, is your recommendation 450 or is it 350? I cannot go to world leaders and tell them, well, either go to 450 or go to 350. I really don't know, and science don't know. Tell me, what is the goal? Is it 450 or is it 350? So the professor went over the whole argument once again, and the Prime Minister interrupted him and said, please, Professor, give me an answer, yes or no. Is 450 sufficient? And there was a silence in the room, I think a cognitive silence, that this was not about science. It is about politics. And in politics, you depend on a clear message. And either the science community concentrate the complexity of their knowledge into those simple political messages, or the politicians do that themselves. And that is the political reality that we're all in the various fields of both economic and environmental science facing. If we are expecting politicians to act upon this, we must be able to present it in a way that politicians can explain each other and their constituencies. So, this is really what this session is about. It's about the interacting complexities of the paradigm shifts in the economy, in the environment, and in politics. And it's about trying to formulate what we know about the mechanisms of all of this in a way that can actually be operationalized at the political level. And I'll try to keep the panel to this political dimension and try to challenge them into actually formulating some political notions of how to proceed in these areas. I will not spend a lot of time introducing the panel. You all have their biographies in your booklet. We will start off with Peter Victor first. He has been working in environmental issues for more than 40 years and is one of Canada's leading experts in environmental economies. After Professor Victor, we will have Jeffrey Heal of the Columbia Business School, who's, like anyone else at the panel, a veteran of the IPCC and a main contributor to the development and environmental economies development. We will then have Jihua Pan, the Director General of the Chinese Institute for Urban and Environmental Studies, yet another IPCC main brain, and we will end up with Ottmar Edenhofer, who will conclude the panel and who, as you all know, is going to lead the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change soon to start its operations. So, Professor Victor, it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Bo, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here, and bright Saturday morning. What a nice way to begin our weekend, to hear about a new approach to macroeconomics based upon some ecological principles. This presentation, as brief as it is a joint effort by Tim Jackson and myself. Both of us have written books on these matters, and having discovered one another 2 or 3 years ago, we decided it would be worthwhile to collaborate on our research, so, which is what we're doing. And towards the end of my presentation, I'll say a little bit about where we are in our latest efforts to develop a macro model that is respectful of ecological principles as well as some good old-fashioned economic principles. So what I'm going to try and do is cover very briefly what we understand as the ecological economics paradigm. I think it's a very attractive one, and I would promote it to you as to incorporate it into your own work. Quickly mention 3 major crises to which I think we have to respond in so many different ways, including within our macro work. Say something briefly about the dilemma of growth, both our sort of requirement for growth, but on the other hand, reasons why we have to question it and maybe not even consider it possible anymore. Say something about why decoupling is not likely to be a solution to these problems. And then, as I say at the end, a quick overview of where we are in our latest modeling enterprise. So, the ecological economics paradigm starts very much from the understanding that the economic system is not a freestanding system. It doesn't exist somehow suspended in isolation in space. It's fundamentally embedded in the biosphere. And so it's very important, therefore, if you're going to understand how this system works, to appreciate its connections to the biosphere. So let me add some of these in. First of all, to keep the economic cycle functioning, we need a continual inflow of materials and energy. And that already provides us one possible set of additional problems to think about. Where do we get these materials from? Where does our energy come from? What are the likelihood of maintaining supplies and increasing supplies in the future? One of the things we know from physics is that all of the material and energy that enters the economy ultimately leaves as waste products. And so we have this flow-through, or throughput, as we say, of materials and energy from the biosphere back into the biosphere in a degraded fashion. And so we have another set of problems emerging here. That is the overloading of the capacity of the biosphere to accept the waste that the economies are producing. When this gets very serious, it can interfere with the biophysical cycles by which the planetary systems function, and that can have a feedback on the capacity to supply the inputs into the economy. And all this is taking place on planet Earth. And the only thing of any consequence that enters the planet is solar energy, and waste heat goes out the other way. And so this is, to me, a fundamental shift in paradigm when it comes to economics, to understand economies as embedded in the biosphere. Not, we got the economy here, the environment here, and maybe we can talk about trade-offs. It's a question of a re-understanding, a reconceptualization of what an economy is. This kind of perspective also raises question, therefore, about the magnitude of these flows. So here's a graph that runs from 1900 to 2005. It's global, and it shows the materials extraction from 1900 to 2005, measured in billions of tons. In the first half of the 20th century, the amount of total material, including fossil fuel carriers, because when you think about it, most energy enters the economy in the form of material first, and that's what's captured in this graph. The total quantity roughly doubled in that 50-year period. And then look what happens in the next half of the century. 700% increase over the initial value of the amount of materials flowing through the global economy. When you understand this, first of all, I'm not going to dwell on it very much, but the fossil energy carriers, particularly oil, is a problem in its own right, and there's the peak oil concern that's out there and needs to be thought about and addressed. I'm not going to say any more about that at the moment in the interest of time. The main thing I want to say is, though, when economies are bringing in all of this additional material every year, it's no surprise that we're having impacts that are now measurable at the global scale. This is now quite a well-known diagram, comes from an article in Nature from October 2009. And around the perimeter of the globe there are 9 fundamentally important issues. At the top you have climate change, ocean acidification, stratospheric ozone depletion. I won't read them all, but they deal with nutrients, they deal with fresh water and land, and so on. What the scientists came up with who put this together was the idea that for each of these issues, there was, if you like, a safe operating space for humanity, which is graphically described by the green circle in the middle of that diagram. It says that we can use the atmosphere for accommodating greenhouse gases, but only up to a limit beyond which we'll be facing some very bad circumstances. You can see for 3 of these variables, they're saying that we've already exceeded the safe operating space for humanity with respect to climate change, biodiversity loss, and interruption with the nitrogen cycle. I emphasize this because this is not just a climate change problem we're looking at. This is a massive assault on many of the Earth's ecosystems that we are confronted with. The second crisis is the inequity that's been discussed quite a lot in this conference, but I just wanted to put a particular graph up here which shows how, on average, the income of high-income countries is still miles ahead of the income of other countries in the world. So that's one way of looking at what's been happening to inequality planet-wide. Here's another picture that tells a somewhat similar story, but in a different way. The shaded countries on this map have populations which in the last 15 to 20 years or so have experienced growing inequality. So within their own countries, their experience is that things are becoming, incomes and wealth are becoming more unequally distributed. And you can see that's in very much in North America and parts of Europe, Africa. Every part of the world has major populations which are experiencing inequality. The third crisis, the banking crisis, we've said a lot about that in this conference. I won't say any more, but it's kind of how are we going to handle all of these 3 problems together, which I think is the real challenge to macroeconomics these days. So now to the dilemma of growth. In an economy like ours, where we have innovation leading to increased productivity of labor, if we don't have adequate economic growth, we know that unemployment will rise. Unemployment rises, consumption can go down, tax revenues go down, deficits go up. Right now, governments are responding to this by cutting back on expenditures. Loan defaults go up, investment goes down, and guess what? We have lower economic growth. And we're in this downward spiral if we don't have enough economic growth. And this, of course, is a major concern. Well, okay, that's part of the dilemma of growth. The other part of the dilemma of growth is that the world simply can't accommodate the kind of growth that we have become accustomed to. One quite useful indication of this is the ecological footprint, which has been estimated globally. The metrics on this is number of planets. We only have the one, but it's an interesting metric. It says that by sometime in the mid-70s, looking at this globally, we were using as much of the planet's capacity to regenerate biological resources as it was capable of doing. And since then, we've begun to exceed that capacity, and we're now depleting natural capital. So on the one hand, we seem to have economies that require growth, not just economies, but the institutions within them. And on the other hand, growth is looking like it's less and less an option. On this issue, which I'm going to come to in a little bit more detail in a moment, of decoupling, we've done very little decoupling of CO2 emissions and GDP going back to 1970. And you can see the latter end of this graph, the latter end of the period here, there's actually a closing of the gap again, that CO2 emissions have begun to rise more rapidly than global GDP. So this is, again, part of the dilemma of growth. We seem to need it, we can't have it. So what are we going to do? Now, Tim, in his book, Prosperity Without Growth, produced this very compelling graphic which shows the challenge of trying to deal with these problems simply through decoupling. So if you look at this graph, on the blue line on the left-hand side, you see that in 2007, that on average, the global economies were operating at a carbon intensity of 768 grams of CO2 per dollar. And that's an average. Some countries, some developed countries were doing much better than that. You can see the UK and Japan. And then what he did, he looked at 4 scenarios. One is, scenario 1, we have 9 billion people by 2050 with incomes growing at trend. We would have to get down to an average carbon intensity of 36 grams per dollar of CO2, of GDP rather, if we are to meet the relatively modest IPCC objective of 450 parts per million concentration of CO2. With 11 billion people, we have to decouple even more. We'd have to go down to 30. With 9 billion people with incomes rising to the 2007 EU level, In other words, also addressing the problem of inequity, we'd have to get down to 14 grams per dollar of GDP. And if we want to raise everybody's standard of living by 2% a year from 2007 to 2050, we've got to get down to 6 grams of CO2 per dollar. That's a 130-fold improvement. Just think about that. And that's in 2050. Many people in this room can remember 1974. 1974 is as far in the past as 2050 is in the future. To achieve this scale of change over that period of time is a monumentally challenging task, and we believe it's too much to think it can be accomplished, and therefore you have to address growth as well, because if the economy is not so big, you don't have to decouple so much. An interesting piece came out of Oxfam recently, introducing the donut. The donut is a graphic that's adapted from the one I showed you before of the planet with the planetary boundaries, but it puts inside the donut a variety of very important considerations of things that a vibrant, successful economy and society should offer its inhabitants, and they're listed there. And the question is, how do you design an economy? How do you develop an economy that can operate within the donut? And that's really what our work on macroeconomics is all about. I began looking at this a few years ago, and I developed a simulation model of the Canadian economy, which I called low growth, because I was interested in exploring the implications of low, no, even growth in the Canadian context. In particular, I addressed the following question. Can we have full employment, no poverty, fiscal balance, reduced greenhouse gas emissions without relying on economic growth? So this is an empirically based model of the Canadian economy using systems dynamics as my approach. Well, if you simply run historical trends forward in the model, in other words, starting pretty much from where Prime Minister Martin left off in 2005 with some nice surpluses in our government coffers, this is what the future would look like. The black line at the top shows GDP per capita rising steadily. The green line shows greenhouse gas emissions rising but not as fast. Unemployment doesn't do very much, goes up, comes down a little bit. The debt to GDP ratio declines steadily. But sadly, the brown line there, the poverty line, which is the UN's Human Poverty Index, continues to rise. This is this increasing inequality being experienced in Canada. We'd have more poor Canadians at the end of another 30 years of regular economic growth than we had at the start. I then said, well, what would happen if we eliminated all of the growth drivers in the model and the economy, starting in 2010, and phased them down over a 10-year period? And you might expect this to be quite disastrous. And you'd be right. Unemployment goes off the graph, poverty goes way up, the debt to GDP ratio becomes completely unmanageable. GDP per capita does level off at the end. You can actually squeeze out the growth in the economy, and it will bring down greenhouse gas emissions. But this is a disastrous, awful scenario, very frightening. So the question is, can we do better? And the nice thing about models of this sort is at least it gives you the opportunity to probe possible answers to that question. So this is a scenario in which growth is ultimately brought to a standstill. GDP per capita levels off around 2030. Greenhouse gas emissions have come way down. Unemployment's come down below where it's been for 50 years. The Human Poverty Index would be the lowest in the world, and the debt to GDP ratio has also come down quite nicely. Well, how do you bring this about? I'll just go through these points very, very fast in the interest of time. This scenario assumes the population and labor force is stabilized, that there's a carbon price, that there's reduced net investment, that there's balanced trade. We don't buy or sell more from other countries. It's inequality. A shorter work year, which is an important way of bringing down the unemployment rate. More generous anti-poverty programs to directly address the question of inequality in Canada. And that sort of package would bring about this sort of scenario. So now to thinking ahead on our current work, I just want to give you one more graphic which sets the stage of ecological economics. Most economists, certainly of my era, were trained to focus on the real economy, the combination of capital and labor to produce goods and services, and all of the stories that we can tell around that and how markets operate to make that work. What we do in ecological economics, and we've done, I think, a fairly good job, is we brought this dimension into the picture. We model economic activity to include material and energy flows in all directions. But what we haven't done within ecological economics, by and large, is to include the financial sector. And I think this is now the big challenge. Can we get our heads around and our models around all three major dimensions? I think a lot of the discussion that I've heard and enjoyed in this conference have focused very much on the top two circles. It's not good enough. We have to include all the time, in my view, in every economic discussion we have, the implications for our interaction with the natural world. So, Tim and I have started to build what we've called GEMMA, and we've set ourselves three questions that we'd like GEMMA to help us get answers to. The first is very similar to the low-grow question. Is economic growth required in advanced economies to maintain high levels of employment, reduce poverty, and meet ambitious ecological and resource targets? We definitely need an answer to that question. But here's a new question for us, but it's a fundamental question. Does stability of the financial system require growth in the real economy? There are certainly people out there who make strong statements to that effect. We think that the modeling exercise will help give us an answer to that question. And the third question is, if we impose restraints on demand and supply in anticipation of response to ecological and resource constraints, will that cause instability in the real economy or the financial economy or both? So this is what we're trying to understand in our work. Here's a very rudimentary graph or graphic of the structure of GEMMA. On the left-hand side, you see a representation of the real economy. We've got a demographic model built in there. We have consumption, of course, as one of the key components of final demand and investment. And we feed all this into an input-output model, which is a very useful framework for tracking the inflow and outflow of materials and energy and waste in an economy. So that fits together really quite nicely. And then on the right-hand side, we have the financial economy. We're working very closely with the system of national accounts, the main sectors that appear there. We track the flows of capital and current expenditures. We follow the framework developed by Godley and Lavoie in using modern monetary theory, and we're putting a lot of data into that. And then you can see some of the other key variables and aspects that play a role here. And I just want to highlight the box which says expectations and uncertainty, something which has been mentioned many times in our conference. We're building that in various ways explicitly into the model. This is where we are. The design of the model is almost complete. We work in Stellar, which is a system dynamics program, and Excel for data management. We've got our initial data sets more or less assembled for Canada, a little less so for the UK. The model is quite far advanced, and we're testing various components of it. And with a bit of luck, we'll have some scenarios that we can share, because I don't have any today, by the summer. So I'll have to leave you with this stay tuned, and we'll have something for you later on. Thank you very much.